morning, everyone, and welcome to Construction Cast. This week we are taking a look at sustainability, which is a little bit of a hot topic in the industry at the moment. Joining me this week we have Jonathan Finnerty, who is the director and co-owner of Green Unit. Green Unit design and build ultra-low carbon modular ARC buildings from their off-site factory in Oxfordshire. Jonathan describes himself on his LinkedIn as passionate about tackling the challenges of climate change through innovation and creative thinking, which is why he founded Green Unit in 2012. We also have with us this morning Annabel Clark, who is Associate Director at Faithful and Gould. Her focus is on environmental and sustainability consulting. Her key experience is in environmental assessment, sustainable design value, asset management and facilities management. She leads the company's BREEAM service, and we'll be talking to her a little more this morning about BREEAM and some of the other certifications out there. And because we always like to have a lawyer on Construction Cars each week, we have Alex Hirom, who is a partner in the construction and engineering team at Addleshaw Goddard. He has 17 years experience on major infrastructure projects, and Alex leads the negotiation of complex construction, operation and maintenance agreements in infrastructure, energy and manufacturing sectors. He has a particular expertise in working on sustainable projects, which is why we've asked him to join us this morning. So welcome to you all. I'm going to come to you, Jonathan, first and kind of start with a broad question on what is sustainable construction. You know, sustainability seems to be the latest buzzword in the industry. What is it to you? Is it perhaps a box ticking exercise to gain a green badge? What are your thoughts?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me on. Well, there's a lot of greenwash out there, but I think now we've turned a page, haven't we? And we're getting serious about sustainability now. So what does sustainability mean to me at the coalface? We manufacture modular sustainable buildings. So what does we manufacture them off-site in a factory, and we ship completed sections to site. We do about 95% of what we do is done in the factory. So yes, so what does sustainability mean to me? Well, as I'm sure most people do, I tend to split it into two parts. So I think about the embodied carbon, and I think about the operational performance of the building as two very distinct separate parts. We're aiming at Green Unit to be carbon neutral, so net zero carbon by latest 2025, but certainly we're working hard to try and get there by close of 23. And what does that mean? It means essentially that the carbon that is consumed in the construction of the building is offset by the carbon savings that the onboard renewables with our buildings will generate. In that regard, the green badge, I think that you mentioned, Annie, where we started off believing that passive house was the way that we wanted to go, but we've decided that passive house don't have enough in the embodied carbon piece for our liking. So we tend not to follow all the passive house rules, but we do cherry pick the bits that we think work well for us. So sustainability for us in the embodied carbon is all about using, frankly, it's timber. We try and source very carefully our timber from local sources whenever possible. So, for example, the cladding on the outside of our building is British poplar. It's quite durable. This has it is heat treated, so there's a bit of carbon in that process. But broadly speaking, quite a benign process to get it into its durable state. I give you one example of one of the raw materials that we use, but of course we can't avoid glass, so we just try and use glass from a local supplier, and in a similar way the trades that we use, because we don't do all the electrical plumbing, we So carbon miles to our factory are important to us as well. So sustainability in the context of what we're doing as part of our engagement and commitments to the One Planet Living framework, which some of you may know is managed by a not-for-profit organisation called Bioregional. We're very committed to that, and it's all about being very faithful to the principles of being, segregating waste streams, minimising waste, which works particularly well in the factory environment. It's about making sure that our product is as low in carbon as it possibly can be, and making sure that our people are also very on board with sustainability and that everybody is pulling together. So that's what sustainability means to us. I'm less fluent in the various arguments for and against the various certifications, the green badges. I'm going to and BREEAM and all those other things.
Thanks, Jonathan. Annabel, I'm going to come to you now. As Jonathan said, there seems to be an unending list of qualifications, standards. Jonathan mentioned a few of them there, certificates, frameworks you can get for sustainability. Perhaps it might be helpful if you give us an overview of some of the key ones and whether there are any that are emerging that people might want to start looking into.
Yeah, of course. Good morning, everyone. You're exactly right, Annie. There are so many out there that it's really important to know which ones are worth pursuing, what they give you, and I guess what the value of them is. We mentioned greenwashing earlier. I think that what a lot of these certifications give you is trust. So it's an independent third-party qualification that has been verified by a different party, so whoever runs that certification. But it's really important to understand, I think, that the certifications, they're a means to an end, they're a framework, they're a process, but unless they're driven in the right way, they can become a tick box exercise. And that's exactly what we want to try and avoid. So trying to think about which assessment you go for, what the value of it is, and what the actual outputs are that we want at the end. So a lot of the certification standards cover sustainability in the broadest sense. So trying to reduce environmental impact, improve the social impact, and reduce cost, so the economics. And it is all of these that make up value. But as we said, if I just run through a few key ones that have already been mentioned. So we have BREEAM, so the Building Research Establishment's Environmental Assessment Method, which probably, the majority of people on this call are familiar with. It's one of the most popular and is often written into planning requirements. It's run by the BRE. It is in the whole used in the UK, although it is an international certification. And it covers 10 main categories. So it covers management, health and well-being, energy, transport, water, materials, waste, land use and ecology, pollution, and then finally innovation. So a huge holistic sense of sustainability. Alongside that, we also have LEED, which is the US version really of BREEAM. Again, it can be applied on an international basis, but in the whole, we see BREEAM rooted in the UK market and LEED rooted in the US market. They cover really similar areas, focusing on that holistic sustainability. We then have Home Quality Mark, which is the replacement for Code for Sustainable Homes. It's also run by the BRE and is applicable to residential properties. There's SCAR, which is a sustainability certification for refurbishments run by RICS. Passive House, as has already been mentioned, you have Passive House certification to look at low energy design. And then what we're really seeing emerging at the moment, talking about those new certifications that are coming through, are assessments such as WELL and FitWell, really focusing on human health. And in the times that we're in now, and COVID-19 obviously playing a huge part of how we interact with buildings, seeing a real focus on health, indoor air quality, lighting, thermal comfort, and how that makes us feel. So those are certainly certifications that we're seeing come through. Alongside that, design for performance has come through with the Better Buildings partnership, is now run by the BRE again, which is looking at energy efficiency in UK offices and how to tackle that performance gap. So what's crucial is that a lot of the assessments I've already listed focus on verifying sustainability in that design and construction phase. They often don't go into the operation. And that's what we're really seeing a drive towards at the moment with design for performance. Another certification that's coming through is how do we make sure that what we promised would happen at the design and construction stage is what a client, the building operator, the building users actually see come through. And the big question, I think, is net zero carbon. How will that be quantified, qualified? We have the UK Green Building Council's verification process out there at the moment, but there are so many certifications emerging. I think what we need in the market is one clear direction so that everyone understands what we're driving towards and making sure that it is comparable with scientific measurable targets so that we avoid any greenwash.
Thanks, Annabel. That's really helpful. On the topic of net carbon, Alex, yesterday it was reported that Boris Johnson is set to announce new carbon emission targets. The new target will be to cut emissions by 78% by 2035, compared to the previous target of net zero by 2050. How realistic do you think this is from a construction industry point of view, and what are the major changes we'll need to see in the industry?
Well, it's obviously hugely ambitious as a cut, and also puts us in a great position as a global leader in ambition as well as delivery going into COP26 in terms of setting the agenda for climate change goals and what globally needs to be done to meet the challenge. In terms of having said it's ambitious, is it realistic for the construction industry? I think the important thing to identify here is that the construction industry can't deliver this on its own, and as with all of the sustainability challenges now, these are systemic challenges across the whole of the economy. So if you think about, well, is the construction industry going to deliver its share of this target on its own? Well, no, it needs to be led ultimately by the users of the things that the industry builds. And if you think of Addleshaw Goddard as a law firm, we assess our sustainability, and a large part of that being a people business is assessing the sustainability of the buildings that we occupy. So as we look for new premises, of course, we are looking for more and more sustainable facilities to occupy. So it's partly down to the users to lead the change, and it's then down to the developers to facilitate that change. And some of our clients are doing really interesting things in this area. So you take British Land, for example, they've set up an internal transition vehicle, which is essentially a self-funded entity for retrofitting their standing estate by levying an internal kind of carbon price on new developments. So they charge £60 per tonne on embodied carbon in new developments, and then they use that fund to retrofit their existing estate. And of course, what's interesting about that is that it motivates their own project managers, designers, when they're looking at new structures to reduce the embodied carbon in those structures to the extent possible. One of the features of where we are with climate change and the challenges in front of us is that we can't pick and choose between the solutions that we adopt. We need to adopt all of the solutions. So we mentioned Passive House earlier, and that's important. But Jonathan also mentioned the issues around embodied carbon, and that's a huge challenge for the construction industry. I mean, each of concrete and steel production contribute, this is each about 4% of global CO2 emissions, so 8% in total. Now, obviously, not all of that steel goes into construction, all of the concrete does. And in the UK, the production of concrete contributes about 1.5% towards the total of the UK's CO2 emissions. So those elements of construction, the materials we use, have a big role to play, but they're also big challenges. If you look at the Leadenhall building, the cheese grater, 50% of the embodied carbon in that building was in the steel and cement. Another 10% in the facade, which is mainly glass. Cement production is a particularly difficult challenge because it involves decarbonising limestone as a process. Aside from the heat used to do that, the process itself releases carbon dioxide in the production of lime. So the only real way to tackle that challenge is through carbon capture. And carbon capture is obviously not something that the construction industry on its own can influence or deliver. It's dependent upon the government putting in place a robust structure through its industrial decarbonisation policy to deliver CCUS and other related opportunities like potentially the deployment of hydrogen as alternative fuels in cement kilns, looking at electric arc furnaces in order to deliver recycled steel and to really start to strip out the carbon from the production of those materials. So I guess there are, to sum it up, is it realistic? Well, yes, it has to be. It's definitely a challenge. It's not one that the construction industry can deliver on its own because of these systemic changes that are necessary to meet our ambitions.
Thanks, Alex. That's really helpful. If there's time, we might pick up some of those points on the steel and concrete towards the end. But before we do, Jonathan, Alex talked about some of his clients doing innovative things. And one of the things that's often said when we talk about sustainability is that you need the right type of client, an enlightened client, say, to build a sustainable project. How do we then persuade those who perhaps don't want to spend the extra money or don't want to go beyond the minimum requirements that these projects need to be sustainable?
I think Annabel touched on some of the problems that need to be resolved about belief and trust in the certifications and the claims that I would make to my customers about sustainability. And I mean, our customers come to Green Unit generally for two reasons. It's quite an organic, unique design. But they certainly come to us for sustainability. Rarely one or the other. It's normally the two combined. But if I look at sustainability generally across the off-site construction world, I think what needs to happen is that there needs to be a commitment from the producer of the building, so the manufacturer, to pin his stripes on the claims that are being made about payback. So if you are going to install solar, what is the payback? If you are going to put in air source heat, what is the payback? And I don't. It's not that I want to shoot myself in the foot here, but I do think that we should be committed to delivering on that. So what are we doing at Green Unit now going forward? All our buildings will go out with the client permission with some thermocoupling embedded in the walls so that we can track the performance of the building and demonstrate to the client that they are getting what we said that they would get. So payback is important, but I think you've got to pin your stripes to the claims that you're making. So we make claims with the new solar system that we're adopting. It's a thin film solar system. That the off-grid version will pay back in. So with battery storage, will pay back within 10.2 years. and just the plain solar without the storage, we calculate will pay back within 6.4 years. So what's going to happen if those targets are not met? Am I going to be held accountable? And all those other things I think need to be ironed out. In terms of other things that we try and do to encourage our clients to accept the premium on sustainability, because it still is a premium until components and raw materials are and possibly even taxation on the less sustainable materials kick in, are still more expensive. So, for example, if I'm talking to a resort, we build units for lots of different sector settings, but the resort market is one of them. And I would say to the resort owner, I said, well, look, I think there's a premium you can probably charge your clients if you've got a sustainable building. You can advertise and differentiate yourself by saying that you are a carbon-friendly resort, and some narrative around all of that. So it is quite difficult to get people to believe, and that's, I think, something that does need to be addressed.
Thanks, Jonathan. Annabel, coming to you next. I'm going to look at waste, because as a society, we're pretty used to the idea of recycling at home, at work. Most of us have recycle bins. We dispose of our waste responsibly. So then when you hear that 32% of landfill waste comes from the construction industry and the demolition of building, it can be quite a shock. So what more can be done to reduce the amount of waste and recycle and reuse the building materials?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really shocking figure, isn't it? 32% of landfill waste, that's over 200 million tonnes, which, if you picture that as a tower of rubbish, of waste coming from construction, that truly is shocking. Those figures have come straight from DEFRA. I think core to all of this is behaviour change, cultural change, change of attitudes to waste. As a society, I know we mentioned at the start that, we are pretty good maybe in our own households at recycling. I would challenge that. I think some households are very good at recycling, but there's still so much more that we can do. And that is bottom down, people getting more involved in recycling, understanding the impacts, that behaviour change, but also coming from our local authorities, the places that we live. Not all councils offer recycling, and they offer completely different levels of recycling. Some will offer just your cardboard, your paper recycling. Some will offer food waste recycling. There's no real consistency across, the globe, but if we just look at the UK, we need that consistency, because I think often people are confused. You take your piece of rubbish, which bin do I put it in? And so we need to make recycling the easiest option instead of making landfill the easiest option. But to be able to do it for the construction industry, it's really key that we enable segregated waste. There needs to be a site waste management plan in place, obviously during the construction phase. Make sure that it's again, making it easy, making sure we have those segregated waste sections. But it starts far earlier than that. When we're building most buildings, we might be demolishing another building. And we need to think of that process as deconstructing that building rather than demolishing it, and thinking about what we can reuse, recycle from that building. And the best way of doing that is to conduct a pre-demolition audit, which those assessments that we talked about at the start hugely encourage. And I guess that's where I'm talking about. From those sustainability certifications, we need to choose the credits that provide the most value. And when we're talking about embodied carbon and those shocking figures around steel and concrete and other construction materials, we need to reuse them so that we're not recreating them on every single project, every single construction site, and releasing more and more carbon emissions through that embodied carbon process. So that waste reporting, reduction, targets for diversion from landfill, holding the design team, the contractor to account, and putting those sustainable practices in through that stage. But then also once the building's in operation, I mentioned at the start, we think of maybe the building process as quite linear. We often talk about the RIBA stages. Of course, that's how we run through a construction process. But thinking about that end of life, and can we make that a circle? So thinking about the circular economy principles that we need to look at. And that starts right from the strategy. So looking at waste minimization through optimized design methods. MMC potentially offer a huge solution to this. So your standardized design, you can much more easily monitor and minimize the waste. I read that it was a 45% reduction in materials that can be seen through MMC construction. We need to respond to the current needs, but also future needs. So thinking about that functional adaptability. So we don't just have to knock down a building when it doesn't quite meet our needs. We can adapt that building, thinking about that right from the start. And also climate change adaptation. So absolutely key that when we're designing our buildings, we're thinking about that climate change scenario and how our buildings will need to function in potentially increased temperatures, extreme weather events, and how they hold up to that.
Thanks, Annabel.
No worries.
I'm going to move on because we've got only a short amount of time, and I want to fit in a couple more questions before we take questions from the audience. You mentioned there modern methods of construction, and Jonathan, I'm going to come to you on that point because your buildings are modular. So how does modular construction improve sustainability? Is it one of the keys to improving the carbon footprint of the industry?
Yeah, I think it's a contributor. I mean, we're at the extreme end of modular, so we ship virtually complete units to site, but of course it can be any variant of off-site construction, from an air conditioning skid that's dropped into the well of a building, to SIP panel production, to truss roof production. They're all MMC, aren't they? They're all off-site. We don't tend to come into contact, as Annabel had just mentioned, with demolition and considerations like that. Generally, our buildings are delivered onto a clean site. I guess there could have been demolition done before we arrive. But just looking at the waste streams, if you imagine how well organized a factory space is, it's a dry space. You set it up, and the waste management system is in place, and you hone it and improve it over time, of course, but it doesn't have to be dismantled and taken to the next site. So it's and Annabel mentioned 45% reduction. There are all sorts of challenges for us because we get a lot of trade subcontractors in. So it's not just what we do at Green Unit in terms of waste cycle management. It's also being very particular about our trade subcontractors to make sure that they also carry out. So plumbers, all the copper snippets get put into a metal box, and it's just getting them to think differently, and that's quite challenging. So yes, I think it works better in a factory environment, and I think you've got much better opportunity to instill these disciplines. You've not got the mud and the weather to distract you, but it's not all plain sailing, and second tier subcontractors all need to come on board with us. Just very quickly, time's running out. We use modern methods of machinery and construction. So we're using CNC to cut our timber. We cut, our accuracy levels can be up to sort of a tenth of a mil. So we're utilizing the materials very well. We get great accuracy, so we're not repeating work. We get it right first time as a general rule. So hopefully that's given you one insight into factory-based lower carbon opportunities.
Jonathan. And finally, before we take any questions from the audience, and if you do have a question for any of our panel, stick it in the chat box. Now, Alex, I'm going to ask you, should people be concerned about regulatory change? What support is out there for the industry that wants to improve, people in the industry that want to improve their sustainability credentials?
Well, I guess part of that first question is who should be concerned about regulatory change. I mean, the best way to approach regulatory change risk is to get ahead of any potential and start doing the right thing now in order to demonstrate what good looks like. So you only need to look at what might be happening with football in Europe. It's the poor behaviour of the clubs that wanted to set up the European Super League that look like they might drive regulation, which people have been talking about for ages in relation to the domestic game in England. So, like I say, it's the good behaviour will lead to better regulation. And regulation will be helpful. I mean, there's no point us abating the carbon emissions from concrete and steel, for example, in the UK, driving up concrete and steel prices for UK resources if we then import unabated resources from outside of the UK. So we may need regulation to address that. So there can be benefits to sensible regulatory change. I mean, the other part of your question was what support is available for those wanting to improve their sustainability credentials. One thing I'd mention is that it's Earth Day tomorrow, as I think we all know, and Addleshaw Goddard is lucky to have Nigel Topping, who's the UK's high-level climate action champion for COP26, speaking on pain and gain for businesses arising out of the sustainability challenge. So if you want more information, there are still places available for that event tomorrow. It's still possible to sign up. But then there are organisations like we mentioned, the BRE, it has its Green Guide, that's a good resource. UK Green Building Council, again, that has good resources. So there are plenty of resources available to support the construction sector. From the legal and contracting side, there's one thing that I would mention is something called the Chancery Lane Project, chancerylaneproject.org, which is a collaborative exercise by lawyers. Yes, I know, lawyers behaving collaboratively. But that sets out to provide model laws and model clauses for contracts to implement climate change objectives. And there are a set of clauses available there in relation to construction contracts that do things like, for example, setting carbon budgets within the contract chain for construction projects and incentivizing delivery against carbon projects. Against carbon budgets for those projects. So there are some interesting and useful things in there if you're in procurement and you're considering how you might implement some of these things through the contract chain.
Thanks, Alex. That's really helpful. We haven't had any questions come in just yet. We might get one or two, perhaps. Oh, wait, one has just appeared. Here's a question. Perhaps I'll direct this to you, Annabel. Change, variance, etc. From a sustainability point of view, how do you view such input to your work and outputs? So I'm guessing, is that asking about what happens when things change during the course of a project? How does that affect the standards?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, isn't it? And I think that a sustainability strategy has to be agile. This market is changing so much at the moment. I mean, we're seeing that just with net zero carbon and the definitions. And, I think everyone on this call is very agreed that we should be looking at whole life carbon, the operational and the embodied carbon, but that isn't the case in the whole market. And I think we just need to be aware that there is change and variance and better understanding of technologies that will come through in the next, well, definitely till 2050, but with Boris Johnson's announcement, hopefully that will accelerate a lot of this thinking. But I think we need to be aware of that, and everything that we plan and design, we have to be thinking about how agile that solution is. So, when we're talking about hydrogen coming online, have we actually put something in place that could switch over to that can we connect into district heating networks? Are we thinking about the future? So I think it's a really important point that we need to think about those impacts and just make sure that we're being agile to that.
Thanks, Annabel. Do any of the other speakers want to input on that one? No, all good. The other point I wanted to ask Jonathan about was Alex's point on steel. Do you think we need to, steel and concrete as an industry, stop using steel, move away from it? Should we be using timber more? What are your thoughts on that, Jonathan? Oh, you're on mute.
I don't know whether anybody has read the Bill Gates book about how to avoid a climate change crisis, which is, I think, a very good pedestrian read. And it sets out the pathways quite clearly, for me anyway. A brilliant book, in my opinion. It's not overly technical, but he tackles concrete and steel in quite a lot of detail. I mean, clearly we can't just, I mean, we've got all the, it's quite comical actually, we've got all the debates at the moment about saving Liberty Steel, but there's been no conversation about what Liberty Steel are going to be doing to perhaps rethink how they make steel. But at Green Unit, we're just about to launch into what's Innovate UK's knowledge transfer partnership. We're doing it with Oxford Brookes University, who are very solid in construction and architecture and engineering. And we're looking at alternatives to steel, because we do have a steel subframe on our building, which I'm not overly happy about, but it's the only material at the moment that is affordable. But we are, for example, at the moment looking at a material called carbon. It's called CFS, another acronym. Carbon fiber stone. It's said to be 3 times stronger than steel, and it's half the weight. I'm not technically able enough, and that's why Brookes are involved, Oxford Brookes, to assess this product. So I think we have to be very creative about looking out there for alternatives. But steel is a hard one to trump at the moment. Governments have got to step in, as Gates says clearly in his book, and create, innovation incentives.
Thanks, Jonathan. Another question's come in. I'm not sure if anyone on the panel can answer this. There used to be an enhanced capital allowances to encourage the use of energy-saver materials and fittings. Is this still in operation, or has it been replaced by something else? Does anyone on the panel know about that? Alex?
I knew that would come my way, and I don't know the answers to that, I'm afraid. This is where the lawyer will defer to an accountant. We haven't got one on the panel.
Have to check with your accountants on that one. A question
The
here.
only thing that I was just going to answer on that one is just not in terms of the capital allowances, but on the materials there, in terms of carbon, there is now accounting against carbon, and I think that's directly contributable to that. So that's your councils can put in place a metric. So at the moment it's £60 to £95 per tonne of carbon, which, as an offset, hopefully make sure that we're looking at that, reducing the energy demand up front.
Okay, thanks, Annabel. And perhaps you might be able to take this one as well. With the majority of construction made up of small and micro companies, can you recommend a carbon measuring tool that they can use to measure their company's carbon footprint?
So I think this comes back to defining carbon and operational carbon or embodied carbon. There are different tools out there. Bruckle Part L, our building regulations, measure regulated energy. We then have unregulated energy that needs to be measured, which is often measured through a TM54 assessment. So that's your total operational. Embodied carbon, there are lots of tools out there. The ones that I'm currently using a lot are one-click LCA. There are many others available. You've got iStruct-T. So you've kind of got those early stage optioneering tools looking at embodied carbon, and then increasingly where there are metrics on embodied carbon, that needs to be done at every REBA stage. And so that's a life cycle assessment, and the key is that it's impact compliant.
Thanks, Annabel. I think on one of our previous episodes of Construction Cast, where we was looking at corporate social responsibility, we talked about a tool, but I can't remember off the top of my head, Jan. So if you go back in the archives, you might be able to find it on one of the previous episodes. And finally, we'll take one more question just before we end. A little bit similar to perhaps something we've already covered, but kind of common question is cost when it comes to going green. Are there systems out there that don't come at additional cost? You know, are there ways to make it cheaper for the client? Does anyone have thoughts on that? Annabel?
Starting as early as possible will reduce cost. The upfront measures when we're looking at sustainability, you know, when we're talking about carbon, the orientation of the building, the form of the building, you know, in terms of transportation, where you're actually placing that building, all of those come at, on a cost plan, effectively no cost. And so make sure that it's looked at as early as possible. For those measures that come in later, so when you have kind of less influence, there are costs, but those are likely to decrease as the market responds to what's happening. The kind of unofficial figures we're hearing are around that kind of 10 to 15% uplift for net zero carbon. There was equally a report that came out from the UK Green Building Council on those cost figures, which is a fantastic resource for looking at that cost uplift, but it's that starting early to make sure you can reduce the cost as much as possible.
Thank you, Annabel. Jonathan, Alex, did you want to add anything on that one?
There's a couple of things that I mean, for example, if you take Celotex insulation material and you compare that with wood fibre insulation, the cost differential is not huge.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that's all we've got time for. I know there's a few more questions we didn't get around to, but perhaps if you're really desperate to know, drop me a line and I can perhaps put you in touch with the speakers for today. All that's left to say is thank you very much to Annabel, Jonathan and Alex for joining us, and to all the participants on the call today. As usual, the video will be up on YouTube in the next day or so, along with a write-up, and we'll see you next month for the next edition of Construction Cast. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.